in a little while.
All right, thank you, Alexandra. And thanks also to my colleague, Jenny Trulock, for her assistance with this. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. The moving to the Siberia of Mexico comes to a theme that is very important to us at the Homestead, which is about immigration, why people move to the places they do, what their goals and aspirations are. And these stories can be obviously very personal to all of us. Almost everybody has got an immigration story that's at least somewhat familiar to them, if not immediate to them. And in this case, we're looking back at a time period many years ago, going back 170, 180 years. But what we try to do at the Homestead is make these stories somehow connect to how people experience immigration in different places and different times. So the Siberia of Mexico comment really came, I don't even know where I got that from. I read it somewhere many, many years ago, and it just stuck in my mind because we tend to think of Los Angeles as being a very heavily urbanized global city with connections to people and environments all over. And in the 1830s, 1840s, it was anything but that. It was a remote, isolated frontier town in the northwest corner of Mexico. And so the Siberia of Mexico seemed to be a really kind of powerful statement about the environment that was here. And also the fact that people would travel long distances in the way that some of these folks here in the Workman and Temple families did was highly unusual. Most people stayed pretty close to where they were born. They might travel to neighboring towns or villages, in some cases maybe to larger cities. And in very rare examples, they might go to another country or two. These people here on the screen, for example, Jonathan Temple on the left and William Workman on the right, traveled extraordinarily long distances, seeking out new opportunities in very different places from where they were from. So again, it's this idea of coming to a place like Southern California or Greater Los Angeles was many years ago. This is a map from a little bit later in the 1840s, but it shows you some of the local spots here. So they don't even show Los Angeles on the map. It's pretty much the missions and some of the other locations in the area. One thing that we try to think about a lot is context and thinking about what was going on in the time periods, and not just locally, but also very broadly. This is a great map showing North America about the time that we're talking about. And you can see how Mexico there in the yellow towards the left was a much, much larger country than it is today. And this ramification of the Mexican-American War, the American invasion, what some people call the first imperial war of the United States, what effect it had at the time, and that still carries over today. So when there's discussion about immigration and boundaries and borders and territory, a lot of that goes back, of course, to this time period. You can also see Texas there in the middle when it was considered to be much larger, at least on this map. Sometimes maps show what maybe people would like to see happen with their boundaries. So if you look towards the center here, I can actually use this pointer, and you can see Santa Fe. This is New Mexico, and there was an ambition when Texas was an independent republic, which it was at the time this map was done, that they would extend the boundaries over into much of New Mexico. And that's relevant to the immigration story of the Workman and Temple families, as we'll talk about a moment ago. As for the United States, it was largely still congregated on the eastern seaboard. There had been gradual migration into what they would call the Old West. And by then, the Old West meant places like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, that sort of thing. And so migrants who might be in New England and the northeastern part of the United States or the southern United States were making their way across into the New West, making their way towards the Mississippi River. That's also part of the Workman migration story. Whereas the Temples, who were up here in New England, not too far from Boston, they decided to try their hand, at new things. So that meant taking a sea voyage all the way down to South America, around the Horn, and into the Pacific. So we have different trajectories, same time period, and different motivations. But the overall goal was probably the same for everybody, which is trying to find a new place to settle and develop themselves with new opportunities. So we'll start with Jonathan Temple. By the way, the individual we'll be talking about, I refer to as the first generation of the Workman and Temple family in our region. They were all born at the very end of the 18th century, the 1790s. Jonathan was the oldest of his family. His father then remarried after Jonathan's mother died, and the second wife had several children, and the very youngest was another figure we'll mention at the end. So there were two Temple brothers we'll be talking about at different parts of the talk. There are also two Workman brothers we'll be discussing. This is a daguerreotype photo, probably from the 1850s. One of the things we'll find here in this presentation is because the time period we're talking about, we don't have a lot of photographs, but we'll look at maps and some other items as well. The Temples migrated from England, we don't know exactly where in that country, to New England at least by 1636. It could have been earlier than that. So we're talking not even 30 years after Plymouth Rock and what could be termed the invasion of Puritans into the so-called New World, which of course was not new. The natives have been here for thousands and thousands of years. And the family lived in different places. Some of them lived in Maine, but eventually Reading was the town that they established themselves in, probably by the 1670s or so. Reading is about 15, or maybe less than that, 15 miles north of Boston. So here's a map of the village. And the Temples were there really from the 1670s well into the 20th century, into the 1920s for sure. So they had a long-standing heritage in New England. But there were Congregationalists in Massachusetts that decided that they were going to really branch out with their missionary work. And so there were Congregationalists all over the world. In fact, there was a man named Pliny Fisk who was a Congregationalist of some fame who spent a lot of time in the Middle East, Palestine, those areas. But one spot that they decided to focus on in the Pacific was an area that was typically known as the Sandwich Islands, which we better know today as Hawaii. And so in 1820, the first missionary showed up there. That was a year after King Kamehameha I, who had unified the several Hawaiian islands, had died. And his heirs, which included his widow, Ka'ahumanu, who was not allowed to be the monarch, but she definitely was the power behind the throne. And then there was Liholiho, Kamehameha II. And they're trying to figure out what to do just to keep their United Kingdom together, while at the same time they start experiencing foreign incursion in different ways. Hawaii was one of the most isolated places on the planet. It was among the furthest from other societies anywhere in the world. So they were just trying to deal with the shock of losing their monarch who unified the islands and now having Congregationalist missionaries come in. This is a drawing from 1821. It says view of the island of Oahu down at the bottom. I can't even pronounce that. What is that? W-O-A-R-O-O. Oahu would be an island. This is Honolulu. I don't see the Waikiki hotels in here quite yet, but we do see some huts. And so it's an era where you start seeing these ships, not just American, but also British and French, coming to the Pacific. And they're starting to stake out their claims for commercial reasons, but also eventually for territorial ones. Of course, Britain was already the so-called master of much of the world at that point, and other countries were trying to get in on the action in the Pacific. We don't know when Jonathan Temple showed up in Hawaii, but it was right around this time, very early 1820s. Now what happens is he becomes one of a group of Yankees who settle in Hawaii, and there are others who are going to wind up in Alta California not too long after that. And I just want to point out a couple of the names on here. The most important one would be William Heath Davis, who was a ship captain, had a very active trading network in the Pacific. And this didn't just mean Hawaii, it also meant the west coast of the Americas, meaning South America, Central America, China, Philippines, and Hawaii became part of that. Davis had a nephew who was William G. Dana, or Dana, according to some people. And Dana's cousin, Richard Henry, was the author of a famous book that hardly gets read these days called 2 Years Before the Mast, one of the better known discussions of the Pacific trade, also of California in the 1830s. And so there's John Rogers Cooper, who was another figure who was operating in Hawaii in those days, later went to California. Thomas Larkin, who became the United States consul in Monterey in Northern California. Alfred Robinson was another gentleman who was involved in this trading network. And then there's Jonathan Temple here too. I'll just mention quickly Abel Stearns, who was also from Massachusetts, was in California the year after Temple arrived here. So what I'm trying to get across is the idea that you have these Yankee merchants who are establishing or expanding actually their trading network. Some of them were operating in Mexico, South America, those kinds of places. And Jonathan Temple was a partner of William G. Dana in a store in Honolulu in the early to mid 1820s. There's not a lot of information about their activities there. We do know that in September 1823, the governor of the island of Oahu, whose name was Boki, B-O-K-I, he seized the property of Temple and a few other foreigners. The reasons were not explained in the diary of one of the Yankees who wrote this down. It could very well have been smuggling or not paying their excise taxes, which was a common practice, not only in Hawaii, but really almost everywhere on the planet, it seemed like in those days. There may have been some other reasons involving politics, but given that they're merchants, it seems more likely it was probably some way to try to evade the legal proscriptions that the Hawaiian kingdom was trying to enforce, because again, they're dealing with the onset of foreign intervention in their situation. And so there may have been some tension going on that would lead people like Temple to leave Hawaii and find other areas to operate. And so what happens is Dana is the master of a ship called the Waverly, which was acquired by the Hawaiian king, Lihohilio, or Kamehameha II, and leased to Dana. And he used that for his trading expeditions throughout the Pacific. And in 1827, Temple writes to John Cooper, I mentioned earlier, who had by then settled in Monterey. That letter still survives, evidently. And Temple told Cooper, I'm going to California in 6 weeks. So he sails on Dana's ship. They arrive in San Diego in July 1827. Within about a week, they're both baptized as Roman Catholics. And that is an indication that they were serious about staying here and trying to find a way to build a life in this area. Now, Dana winds up going to Santa Barbara up here. I don't know if you notice this, some of these inlets are wildly inaccurate on these maps. San Gabriel does not sit on the shoreline there. Sorry for that little Freudian slip a moment ago. And you can see how the shoreline is not represented very well. Dana goes to Santa Barbara. Temple stays in San Diego very briefly, but he decides he's going to go to Los Angeles, which is misspelled here. It says Ciudad, it should be Ciudad de Los Angeles rather than Angelos. And he is the second American or European to settle in that little pueblo when he arrives in 1828. There had been a gentleman who had been on a ship back in the late 18 teens who had been shipwrecked, and his name was Chapman, and he wound up living in Los Angeles a little before Temple did. This is a little bit later of a rendering, but it was purported to show what Los Angeles would look like during this time period. And you can see it's a pretty small community. It looks like we're about from the southwest, looking up towards the hill ranges, Verdugo Hills maybe, or this could be even where Griffith Park is located. Back in the background would be what they called the Sierra Madres back then. We know now as the San Gabriels. Maybe Bunker Hill would be off here to the left. And again, it was a remote outpost. Los Angeles did have the largest population of the three, that's right, 3 towns in Los Angeles, or in California at that time. There were some other settlements that had presidios or military establishments. And by far the most established Spanish and Mexican elements were the missions of that period. What Temple did is he opened the first store in Los Angeles. So again, this goes back to how remote the area was, how self-sufficient people had to be. The Spanish speakers of California, whether they were native born or had migrated from Mexico or other places, had come to call themselves Californios because they were so isolated from Mexico City and from the levers of government that they really had to be self-sufficient. There wasn't that much support coming from the central government. And
Paul,
in fact, it was, yes, go ahead.
we've got a question coming in.
Okay.
When Luis on Facebook asks, was it common to be baptized in order to be indoctrinated into the community?
That's a great question. And yeah, I started to allude to that. I could have gone into a little more detail. Absolutely. What you would want to do is become a Catholic for a number of reasons. And by the way, it's often stated that extranjeros, or foreigners like a Temple or a Stearns or others, they had to marry into a Californio family to get property. And that's not true. What they had to do was become a citizen. And to become a citizen, you had to be a Roman Catholic. So getting baptized was a step towards that. And sometimes figures like a Temple or others would get baptized first and then wait a while, or sometimes not at all. They wouldn't even become citizens. He did. He also married into a local family, the Cotas of Santa Barbara, and they had relatives here in Los Angeles. And that's his entree into buying property. And then if you want to become involved in the social life, the political world, that's going to help you as well. So absolutely, becoming a Roman Catholic was almost essential if you wanted to do anything in that era as one of the very few foreigners in the region. Great, thanks for that question, by the way. So what Temple did is he opened the first store. This is a 2-story skyscraper. They had almost exclusively 1-story adobe buildings in those days. Very few people had them. The Lugo family, a very prominent California family, had theirs off the plaza. And what I was starting to allude to with the Californios, again, was because of their isolation. You couldn't even travel directly from Mexico City by land to California for much of the early years of the Mexican Republic, because the Indians, the natives of northern Mexico and what we now call the southwestern United States, were obviously not crazy about having people go through their territory. And the shipping and the travel by sea could be very difficult too. The currents and those sorts of things could often be quite treacherous. So anyway, Temple might be, I'm assuming, the gentleman here in the frock coat and the top hat, not the kind of clothing you want to wear in a climate like this most of the year, but he probably would have worn that in Hawaii, which is even kind of more ridiculous when you think about it, tropical environment. But in any case, he became pretty prominent through his store and through other activities that he was engaged in. And because he was the first, he got a leg up on that commercial trade. And so because he had a background from New England and to Hawaii as a merchant, he could tap into those sources of material goods and have them brought to Los Angeles. It's just a shame we don't have details about that. When you go back this far, it's very hard to find some of the documentation. One of the areas we do see, though, are letters between some of these individuals from the United States who were operating in California. So I mentioned Thomas Larkin, who was the US consul in Monterey. He was a merchant as well. And he had an active correspondence with people like Temple, and those letters got saved. So fortunately, we were able to get some information about some of those trading networks that were going on back at the time. And as an example of getting involved in the local community, sometimes those could be positive things. You marry into a family, you establish those relationships. You might be a padrino or a godparent, and you have relationships with people in different ways. Sometimes, though, they came up against some very difficult situations. And part of the issue, for example, with the law is that in Mexican California, because people knew each other very intimately, because a lot of them were related by some connection, but also because it was a tight-knit, small group of people, dealing with things like crime was often, in civil matters too, a question of trying to reconcile the problems that were going on between people. For British residents or people from England, for people from the United States, they were used to a civil law system, common law system, where you had trials, you basically had punishment as a result of your crimes. And so an example of where this change was starting to come about is in 1836 in the spring. There had been a woman who had a lover, and they decided to kill her husband. He was found dead on the road from Los Angeles to San Gabriel. And so it was obvious to a lot of people that they had committed this crime. But what would normally happen is you would go and deal with this in the existing civil law system of Los Angeles. They did have courts, they did have judges, but they were not well financed. There wasn't a lot of effectiveness in the minds of the extranjeros or foreigners who were living in the area, and they were pretty upset about how things had been developing anyway. Now, again, this is less than a decade after Temple showed up in Los Angeles. So he hosted, as this account in a 1920s newspaper mentions, 50 of the most prominent people in the town, they say assembled quietly, I don't know how they would know that in the 1920s, at Temple's home. In orderly but determined fashion, they organized what they called the Junta Defensora de la Seguridad, or the Vigilance Committee. This is the first of its type in California. Vigilance committees became pretty common after the American era began in the 1850s, into the 60s in many parts of California. The president was a Frenchman, Victor Proudhon, or Proudhon, and there were others who were Californios involved, Manuel Arzaga, a secretary, Francisco Araujo, as a commander. And I think the effort here was probably directed by the foreigners, meaning the Europeans and Americans, to organize this and get buy-in from the Californios. And maybe this particular crime was relatively easy to do in this sense because it seemed kind of cut and dried. However, there were people in town at the time who did protest about this. They wanted to see the confirmation of law or the actions of these people conform to what the law was at the time. And as typical for these committees, their junta met very briefly. They had a very short trial. It was all one day, found the two people guilty and had them executed. And their bodies were actually displayed in town as a warning to others. And so this was a kind of a abrupt and very blunt reminder of how things were going to be changing as the foreign element grew, as their power grew, and later on they began to be the ones who would really organize and carry these kinds of committees out in the gold rush era and a little bit later. Now, to go back to Juan's question and the idea that Temple becomes a Catholic, he does marry very shortly thereafter Rafaela Cota, who is here on the left of this portrait. She was, again, from Santa Barbara, but she had family members living in Los Angeles. And that happened a lot, where people living in various communities had these connections because of the sparse population of Europeans in Alta California. And this is Temple, and their son-in-law, Gregorio de Ajuria, who was a native of Spain, was a merchant. He was very connected in Mexico. He had a lot of interesting contacts in the government there with powerful figures. And he must have had some trade network coming into Los Angeles, where he met Rafaela, the daughter, Francisca, the daughter of Rafaela and Jonathan Temple. So this is Rafaela, this is Francisca, and her husband and one of their children, probably a little bit later than this photograph, sometime in the 1850s. These are all daguerreotypes. But again, it's this idea of becoming integrated into the community. But what this marriage also did for Temple, and we'll talk about this in a subsequent presentation in this series, is Temple would utilize his son-in-law's connections in Mexico in very interesting ways. Now we're going to transition to the other part of the family, same generation, and talk about the Workman brothers. This is the only known photograph of David, and then his younger brother was William. These two were from another, I would call this almost the Siberia of England in some ways, although people living in this area may not agree with that. But I say that because this was northwestern England, very close to the Scottish border, very far removed from a lot of the major population centers and financial areas of England. London is on the complete opposite of the country. Now, the family moved around a bit over time. In fact, the father of David and William, Thomas, was a glazier. He installed glass, probably stained glass in churches, and he migrated down to London, which was quite a big jump, because the Workman family was living in this area of England from the 1500s. And so for him to go down to London was kind of an unusual thing. So maybe this, I don't know if it was wanderlust, or at least the idea of trying to seek out a better life was passed down through, from father to sons. Thomas married a woman who was from a suburban area of London, Surrey, to the southwest. They had their first child down there. And then, because Thomas inherited property from a childless aunt and uncle in the town of Clifton, they settled there. And they became fairly well off compared to a lot of the folks in that location. So Clifton is where the Workman family settled and remained for quite a number of years. Now, William Workman was born in a village ironically called Temple, Sowerby, because his daughter later became a Temple, but not too far away, probably 10 or 12 miles distant. So this is the house that the Workmans inherited from this childless aunt and uncle of William and David's father. And it's a pretty substantial building in Clifton. This was, I think, taken about 1912 when one of the Workman family went back from Los Angeles to visit there. This is how it looked fairly recently. It's been subdivided, as you can see. That's why the paint colors are so different. There's a fence there now. Someone occupies this part. And lately, this has been a bed and breakfast. And I know our former director, Karen Wade, has actually stayed there. Now, Clifton was, again, isolated. There wasn't a lot of opportunity if you were somewhat ambitious. The interesting thing is that David was the eldest surviving son in the family, which meant by the laws of primogeniture that he would inherit anything that his father and mother would leave behind, but that didn't keep him in Clifton. When he left, William became the oldest son, and he would have inherited as well. And he also decided not to stay. So I think that's maybe testament to the fact that they didn't see much of a reason, obviously, to stay in this part of the world. Both David and William were apprenticed to be saddlers, to work with saddles and harnesses and that sort of thing for horses. And that's not a upper class occupation, obviously, but it was one probably considered to be a stable one that could bring them some income. But they both decide to leave. So David leaves about 1817. Now the War of 1812, which actually concluded 3 years after that, had just been settled. And so because that was between Britain and the United States, there would be little, if any, immigration at all during that period of time. But afterwards, you start seeing a pickup or an increase in British migration to the United States. And David is part of that movement, probably in 1817. He winds up very shortly afterwards migrating to Missouri. So if you look at this map, this is a little bit later, but it hadn't changed much. This was the end of the United States at that time. So again, it's kind of like the Siberia of the US, if you want to look at it that way. And David winds up right about here in the middle of, Missouri became a state, by the way, in 1820, just after he arrived. And he settled in a town called Franklin along the Missouri River. That had been settled by sons of Daniel Boone. If you know that name, he was kind of a famous individual at one time in America. And you can see the states next to this. A lot of the settlers of central Missouri came from places like Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. There's the Cumberland Gap. As they migrate, maybe they go along the Ohio River, they cross the Mississippi. So there's a lot of movement of people from the southern states, central southern states, into Missouri. Some, however, are also coming from what was called the Old West. An example would be John Rowland, who we'll bring into the story in a moment. He was in Ohio for many years and traveled down the Ohio River to the Mississippi and then to make his way where he's going to go. Now, David settles in Franklin. He opens a saddlery. He's got a partner first, and he's on his own for a while. And he becomes pretty involved. When they decide to move the town because of flooding from the river from the south side to the north side, he became a trustee of the new town of Franklin. This is a newspaper advertisement from 1828 showing him as one of the 8 or 9 people who is trustee of this new community. So he's established himself. Incidentally, Missouri was an admitted state in 1820 because of the Missouri Compromise, which involved how to deal with slave and free state admission in the US. Missouri was a bit of an issue because you can see you've got the southern states here, you've got the northern states where there isn't slavery, and Missouri is kind of in the middle of that. And that caused a lot of problems later in the Civil War. Missouri became a slave state. David Workman did own a few slaves during his 30 or so years living in that area. So again, just some examples of David's life in Missouri. He's got a partnership in the saddlery. They break it up at this time. One of the more interesting aspects of David's life out there, and if you ever see his name at all, which is pretty rare, it's usually because of this one thing. He had an apprentice who ran away from the saddlery in September 1826. By the way, about a year after William, David's brother, left and went to New Mexico. And the young man was named Christopher Carson. He became famous as Kit Carson, a trapper, a scout. He worked with the military during the Mexican-American War. And again, he's one of those names like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett that you used to hear a lot about, especially in the 1950s during that whole era. Not so much these days. But this is an advertisement for the return of Carson. David Workman was obligated legally to advertise. You can tell he didn't really care whether he got Carson back because the reward he asked for was just 1 cent. And who's going to return somebody and spend the time to get paid 1 penny? But that was the legally required minimum reward you could give. Now, William, who was born 2 years after David, remained behind in Clifton, but David goes back in 1822 to see his family. I'm sure that was important to him, but also to collect on a bequest that the parents had given to the 2 sons. It's not really readable on screen here, but this is the document that was located. There's a man who lives in Clifton, that little village that the Workmans lived in for so long, John Sharp. John was a member of the police establishment there in northern England. So he had detective skills that he utilized to great effect and went through a lot of the papers and documents in the official archives of these areas. And he came across this probably about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And it is the document from Thomas and Lucy Workman to William in 1822, where he is going to receive 800 pounds, which is a substantial amount of money, that he could use for anything he wanted to. David had one of those documents as well. So David came back in 1822 to cash in. I think he had taken about half his money to go to America 5 years before, returns to get the rest of it. And this was probably done in June 3rd, 1822, because the parents realized that William was going to want to join his brother and they might as well go ahead and execute the agreement and let him take his money and go to the US. Now, one of our longtime colleagues at the homestead, Max van Belgoy, quite a number of years ago, went to the National Archives, and he was able to unearth the shipping manifest of David and William's travel from Liverpool, which was the major port close to the area of England that they were from, to Philadelphia. And again, it's a little bit hard to read, but David Workman and William Workman are listed here as settlers. There's two of them, one trunk, there's a box of tools and other goods that they brought with them. These are really hard to find. It was kind of amazing that Max was able to locate this so many years ago, because it really gave us some good information about the origins of William coming to America. Of course, David had been here a little while before. Now, they wound up going to Missouri, and again, this is the early to mid 1820s. The Mexican Revolution had taken place after 10 long years of fighting against Spain. Spain had been a long decaying empire. In fact, Napoleon had installed his brother as the king of Spain about the time the Mexicans revolted. And they won their independence. It was a brief empire, and then a republic was established, much along the lines of the United States. But with any new country, there are going to be problems. It happened in the United States. We had the Articles of Confederation, and all kinds of problems ensued. How centralized is your government as opposed to federalized, with states having power and that sort of thing. And the same thing happened in Mexico in many ways. So these remote territories, these Siberias of New Mexico, of what is now Arizona, of California, and of Texas, were going to be very hard to manage, even in the best of circumstances. And that was hardly the case as Mexico went through frequent revolutions and upheavals in Mexico City. The church is trying to retain its power, the military, the landowners, and the politicians. But one thing that Mexico was willing to do after independence that Spain never would have entertained was openness to outside contact. And that meant trade, it meant settlement. So as an example, in 1821, just as Mexico became independent, a man named William Becknell opened a new trading route from Franklin, Missouri, where the Workmans would be living, to New Mexico, and it was called the Santa Fe Trail. So this is a map from a little later. It shows one of the routes as it wended its way through some pretty hostile territory in terms of environment, hot deserts and plains and that sort of thing, as well as Indians who weren't too happy about having these folks go through their territory. And into Santa Fe. It later became a wagon road. You can see this is the route. So this is what William Workman did in 1825. He only stayed in Missouri for a couple of years, working for his brother in the saddlery, and then joined one of the trading caravans that left in the spring and arrived in Santa Fe about the early part of July. I was at the Huntington Library years ago, just walking through an exhibit in the old library, and I looked in the case, and there was the ledger book that you would sign when you checked into the customs house at Santa Fe, and it happened to be open to the very page that had William Workman's registration in July 1825. How an official document from the Spanish or Mexican period got to the Huntington is an interesting question. But he arrives in Santa Fe. He doesn't stay there long. He migrates north. It's a little hard to see in this part of the map. I'll show you one later that shows the name. But he goes to Taos. Taos was an old Indian Pueblo community. It's still there, still very vibrant community. And then the Spanish, later the Mexicans, and some foreigners established their own community just to the south of the Indian Pueblo. Taos, to a lot of us today, is known for its arts scene, kind of an art colony. In these days, it was a fur trapper's haven because the Rocky Mountains are in that area, of course. And so a lot of foreign fur trappers especially were headquartered in Taos. And that's probably what drew Workman to that part of New Mexico.
Paul?
Yes.
A little bit earlier, sorry, about a minute or so ago, you were talking about the value of land and estimation. We had a question that came in that wanted to kind of get a better understanding, if we could, of how much money would that be worth today?
Well, I'm trying to think of the example that I gave about land. Does anybody recall what I said about that?
I'll ask Mary to give us some more clarification on her question. Okay.
You can certainly stop and do that. Okay, so another detail from that same map. So again, you can see Santa Fe. What's convenient here, this is a little bit later than we're talking about, but Santa Fe had 3,000 people, far and above, probably more than triple what Los Angeles, for example, would have had. Albuquerque, 5,000. So, and Taos even 2,000. So these were, New Mexico, at least this area, was much more heavily populated than what we saw in Los Angeles back then. Workman does engage in fur trapping very early on from Taos. Again, he arrives there in 1825. In 1827, he joined a fur trapping group led by a father and son named James, Ohio, Patty, and I forgot, and Sylvester. They traveled down the Rio Grande, went to southern New Mexico, and then they went across to the Gila River, and they trapped that through what is now southern Arizona to where Yuma basically is today, and they stopped there. And some of the members decided they wanted to press on into California, and others did not. Those that went into California were arrested because they didn't have a permit. They weren't supposed to be there. In other words, they were kind of like illegal immigrants. And these are Europeans and Americans doing this in Mexican territory. And Workman and the others decided, maybe wisely, to leave that area and go back into New Mexico. But he was on the California border about 15 years before he settled here. Fur trapping is a tough business, though. It's a lot of time out in the wilds. And over time, the number of animals that you could find will be decreasing quite a bit. They weren't environmentally conscious at all. It was get as many of the furs as you can, as quickly as you can. It was a rage for beaver fur hats and that sort of thing in the eastern United States and in Europe. And so he probably decided it was better maybe to outfit and supply their fur trapping expeditions as opposed to going out and doing the work himself. Kind of like in the gold rush, where instead of digging for gold and doing all the hard work, maybe you could have a hardware store and sell the implements at very high prices with a nice profit margin in order to, to make your living. And so that was probably the equivalent out here in Taos, was outfit these people. Workman at one time, in fact, expended $4,000 of his money to outfit an expedition that he had a financial interest in. They wound up not being very successful, but the fact that he could front that kind of money and not make it back indicated how well he did. We don't have a lot of examples like that. All right, this is a very fascinating document because it was written by Workman within about 6 or so months after he got into New Mexico, probably 8 or 9 months. And it is a letter that he wrote to his brother David, who was in Missouri. This is February 13th, 1826. It's reputed to be the oldest surviving letter of a extranjero or foreigner in New Mexico. And Workman hadn't learned Spanish yet, so this is Toes, T-O-E-S, rather than Taos. She's trying to write, I think, San Fernando, because that was a community to the south of Taos that he settled in. And he's writing to David and explaining, first of all, that he hadn't heard from him for a while and that he had almost died of a sickness during the winter. And he pulled through. He talked about the fact that there were no doctors, no medicine, and it was a very rough place to be. Later on, he asked his brother, though, could he send him materials to build a still for manufacturing liquor? But he told him to pack them very carefully, for these are contraband. So remember that Jonathan Temple had his property seized in Hawaii back in 1823, maybe because of smuggling and evading the law. Well, here's what Workman's doing in New Mexico. He wants to make liquor. And the reason why this is contraband is because it was forbidden for foreigners to do that. The Spanish and then the Mexicans were keenly aware of the effect of alcohol, not just on their people, but obviously on the natives. And there was a large Indian pueblo in Taos, obviously, and so they tried to limit that. A few years after this, they rescinded that, and they allowed people to manufacture liquor, that is foreigners. And so Workman and his friend and partner, John Rowland, became major distillers. Their prize product was called Taos Lightning. It doesn't sound like a subtle, smooth after-dinner aperitif, but when you're a fur trapper out in the wilds for months at a time, you don't want that. You want something that's going to be very powerful. So Taos Lightning probably did the trick. Now, that partnership with Rowland probably happened very quickly. Rowland was of British ancestry, perhaps Welsh. He was born in a corner of Maryland, very close to the Pennsylvania border, and he seems to have lived in both of those states. He was born actually a few years prior to the Workman brothers, early 1790s. But he and his family migrated to Ohio. Again, part of that New West. There was a mass migration into that part of the United States in the first part of the 19th century, 1800s into the 1810s. He remained in Ohio until about the early 1820s and then made his way westward. He went through St. Louis, apparently, and then he was in Taos about 2 years prior to William Workman. Rowland's occupation was he was a miller by trade, had a flour mill. And then he and Workman joined forces to manufacture that Taos Lightning.
Paul, a couple of questions about, before we go too far off from the fur trade. Luis asks, was the fur trade waning by this point?
The fur trade in the early 1820s was probably at a peak. And so by the time Workman shows up in 1825, yeah, I think there's starting to be a downward trend with that. It was just so many people in the Rocky Mountains region. A lot of them, by the way, were French fur trappers who had come down from areas that France had controlled, Canada, the Midwest, British, American, and there were also Spanish-speaking fur trappers too. But yes, I would say that by the time he got involved in that, when that 1827 expedition happened, it was starting to wane. And
He
so
goes
that's
on to
another reason.
ask,
Go
he
ahead.
goes on to ask and to comment, I'm having a hard time imagining how all these diverse people communicating with each other being so remote. Did Temple or Workman know Spanish? Were translators common? Or did they just throw themselves into the culture and figure it out?
I think it depends on the time frame that they're there. So Workman, Temple, and Rowland, they all lived in Mexican territory for roughly 20 to 25 years. And it seems to me that at some point during that time period, you're going to have to become somewhat familiar with the language. Now, having said that, John Temple's store in Los Angeles, he had a Spanish-speaking employee. So maybe that individual, Garcia was his name, would do most of the work with the Spanish-speaking clientele, and Temple might do more with the English-speaking clientele. But I would imagine, though, that still you'd have to have some understanding. Now, as anybody knows, learning a new language in your late 20s or into your 30s can be pretty challenging. Spanish may be easier to learn for some than, say, Spanish speakers trying to learn English, for example, because the structure of the language is maybe a little tougher to get a hang onto. There is a source in the Workman family that said years later that Workman and his wife did not speak the same language at all. And I find that a little hard to believe that they couldn't communicate, at least in some form, at least in one of the two languages, probably Spanish, but that's what she said. And so it's an interesting question that you bring up about the relationship these foreigners are having in these communities and their ability to communicate with them.
Great.
Is there another question, Alex, from people?
We have some clarification of the questions that were asked about value of by today's money, but if it would be preferable, we can get back to those at the end. It's up to you.
Sure. Yeah, I was trying to think of I think what I was maybe referring to was the 800 pounds that Workman got from his family.
We had folks help right away. So one person said, perhaps the question is, what would the value be today of the monies the Workman brothers received from their family?
Yeah, I did look that up at one time. I have forgotten what it was, but it was thousands of dollars. I know that. So it was for that time, that was a pretty substantial amount of money. And but yeah, it'd be interesting to know, for example, what would passage on the ship be? What would the fare be to go from Liverpool to Philadelphia? That sort of thing. So.
And also maybe the amount of money that the Temples gave to their son, Jonathan, half when he left and then came back for the other half?
Well, Jonathan, I don't know if he received any money from his family. What I was referring to were the Workman brothers. They each had a document that was a bequest that was given to them by their parents with the stipulated sum of 800 pounds. And that's two, so 800 times two. So there's no question that the family had means above and beyond what almost anybody else would have in that part of England, outside of the nobility who would own the local lands and that sort of thing.
Another question that just came in is, spoken Spanish is very different from written Spanish. Any Spanish-speaking documents from Workmen or other Americans in LA that you have come across? Who became literate in Spanish?
Yeah, that's another great question. Sometimes you see these documents and you can tell the signature is different than the writer, but that could also apply to anybody who was Spanish-speaking, because again, literacy was very, very limited. And so I've seen quite a few documents from Spanish speakers or people who've got Spanish language surnames, let's put it that way. And you can tell that whoever wrote that was not the person who signed it. So it's pretty common to have your scribes would be a common term. In pre-literate societies or those who were not very literate, you had those people who, that was kind of a job they had. They would charge you money to write out letters, official documents, and that sort of thing. I'd be surprised if William Workman had as much familiarity in written Spanish, obviously, as he would in any form of spoken Spanish. And I haven't seen a letter or a document where you can tell that he wrote it. I've seen documents where he signed them. And it looks like the writing is different than the signature, for sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And again, it gets to that idea of how familiar you can be with some of the traditions and practices of the society that you're belonging to. One thing I should mention, this is a good document to bring this up, is when he was baptized, a Roman Catholic. So Jonathan was baptized in California in 1827. He had a baptismal name already, Juan. It was easy to do. William Workman didn't, so he chose, or it was chosen for him, you can see it here, Jose Julian as his baptismal name. So it says Jose Julian, an apellido or appellation or name of Workman. And this is his baptismal document, lists his father and his mother and so forth. And so, yeah, the question of how much he would be able to speak or to write the language is one we don't have a really good handle on, because that's true for most people at that time. There's just very few documents that you get from that era. Okay. All right, so again, the idea of settling in a place and becoming, as you see here with this document, a Catholic. This is June 1828, when Workman is baptized by a pretty prominent member of the clergy, Antonio Jose Martinez, in Pueblo back in those days. Now, Workman then had a marriage with Nicolasa Urioste, who was a native of Taos, born a few years after he was. We don't know a lot about her either. The story of women is very hard to get a handle on in these periods and these locations. But she was probably had some connection to the Pueblo because she had their two children, Antonia Margarita, who was born in 1830, and Jose Manuel, who was born 2 or 3 years afterwards. They were baptized in the church in the Pueblo, in the Indian Pueblo, which is perhaps telling about her connection to Native ancestry out there. Interestingly, the Workmans did not have a church-sanctioned marriage in New Mexico. That was not only a common thing for the extranjeros, or the foreigners like Workman. Many of the locals who were Spanish, Mexican, Indian did not have church marriages, purportedly because the fees were kind of excessive to have these marriages. There was a book written about this topic that is pretty enlightening on that subject. In any case, William and Nicolasa did not have a church marriage until 15 years later, 1844, at the San Gabriel Mission here in California. I alluded to earlier, showing that map, that Texas became an independent republic in 1836. Again, the Mexican idea of allowing extranjeros or foreigners to settle in their remote territories, hoping that they would do what Workman and Temple did, convert, become a citizen, and become a loyal Mexican citizen. That was the hope that they had. And of course, a lot of Americans were coming from southern states, much less other parts of the United States, who did not have an interest in that. And so they were unhappy for a lot of reasons. They had racist views about Mexicans, clearly. And so the revolt in Texas, where it's a Davy Crockett thing, did he die bravely at the Alamo or not? Those debates have been going on for a long time. The Republic of Texas is formed and existed for about a decade, 9 years. And very quickly, the leaders of the country of Texas wanted to expand to the Rio Grande. And that meant Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Taos are all on the Texas side of the river. So they weren't too happy about these ambitions that the Texans had. In 1840, the president of Texas, Mirabel Lamar, sent a message out to the citizens of New Mexico saying that he had appointed a commission of 3 individuals to talk about commercial possibilities. That was code for, we're going to invade you and disguise it as a commercial expedition. And the guy that sent this message across was named William G. Dryden. Dryden later came to Los Angeles and became a judge. He was a friend of Workman and Rowland of long standing. And Workman and Rowland were named as 2 of the 3 commissioners. And that didn't last long. Very quickly, a new commission was named, including, by the way, 1 Latino or one member of New Mexican society. But Workman and Rowland may not have been approached about this. They may have just been put on there as members of this commission without their permission. But in any case, it gave them, as you can understand, a bit of a reputation. And there'd already been that problem. In 1837, there was an internal revolt that was started by members of the Taos community. They overthrew the governor, killed him actually, and then took power. There was a counter revolt led by a man named Manuel Armijo. And this was, again, Latinos in New Mexico in a struggle over power there. But when the rebels of Taos took over the government, it was reported in a Missouri newspaper back in Franklin, the town Workman had lived in for a while, that Rowland and Workman were forced to swear loyalties to the Tauseños who had instigated this revolt. Well, once the Tauseños were overthrown by Armijo, who then became the governor, that cast suspicion on people who supported the Tauseños, whether they did that willingly or not. And so shortly after the rebellion happened, Workman and Rowland were arrested for smuggling. And that seemed like a political act because a lot of people smuggled, and they'd been there for 15 years by that point, roughly. And so the question was, were they arrested because they were, it was kind of payback for whatever happened with the rebellion. Then 3 years later, the Texans decide they're going to come out and engage again in this sort of commercial expedition that was masked as an invasion. By the time the Texans launched their expedition from Austin, and it was a long trip across very difficult territory, Rowland and Workman had already prepared to leave, along with other estranjeros or foreigners. Michael White, for example, who was from England, who had moved to California. He was a sailor, and he had taken ship and jumped ship, actually, and stayed in Los Angeles. Then he went to New Mexico for a couple of years, became friendly with Workman. They were both British. He was on that group. Benjamin D. Wilson, a native of Tennessee, who was a merchant in New Mexico and wanted to go to China. He was a member of this group of foreigners who were going to leave New Mexico and go to California, and there were many others. On the screen here are a couple of documents that were given to Workman in July 1841. This is the part of the legal permit that was given by the authorities there. And so you can see it's for the years 1840 and 41. It's got the seal, and there's some information about Workman is going to be taking some goods of a certain value. I think it says 800 pesos, and travel to California. Augustine Duran, who was the administrator of the entity that was doing this. And then there is a document that came with it that would specify it's a certain number of boxes of effects. You can see carga de efectos here as one example, that ocho cargos. It's a little hard to read what that is there, but it's listing the material and the value of those items with Workman's signature on the bottom. So as came up earlier, this is Workman's signature. You can clearly see he didn't write this. Now, this is also a legal document that somebody would do, a secretary, probably to Duran, who would be writing this out. But these are indications of the migration that he is going to take with others to go to California in 1841. What is formed has been called different names. Sometimes the Workman and Rowland Party. Years ago, we decided at the Homestead to refer to it more as the Rowland and Workman Expedition, because John Rowland really had more of the official capacity here. He compiled a list of the members to give to the authorities in California when they arrived. And he seems to have had more of the connections once he got out here. He had purchased horses, by the way, on Rancho La Puente in 1834. And now it's 7 years later, and they're going to go out to California. Now, there were not only Americans and Europeans on this group. The party had gone to Santa Fe to leave, and they made their way on this trail that was a trading caravan given the name Old Spanish Trail. It was neither old nor Spanish. It was started in 1829, well into the Mexican era. It was only about a dozen years old by this time. But in any case, this was a new route from Santa Fe to Los Angeles for commercial purposes. So typically woven goods, blankets, sarapes, that sort of thing would be manufactured in New Mexico and transported to California. In return, they would bring horses and mules. I read somewhere that the Missouri mule was really a California mule transported to New Mexico by the Old Spanish Trail and then on the Santa Fe Trail out to Missouri. By the way, I'm going to mention this now before I forget, but El Monte likes to advertise itself as the end of the Santa Fe Trail. The problem with that is the end of Santa Fe Trail is pretty obvious. It's called Santa Fe. The Old Spanish Trail would take you out to Los Angeles, and then there was a route later on that went south through Yuma and that area. But we won't let El Monte have to take their name away. They can keep the Santa Fe Trail thing. The point is the expedition made its way westward from Santa Fe and got to Abiquiu. Listed here as Abacui, but Abiquiu was a community almost exclusively of people who were Genezaros. In other words, they were a mixture of Spanish and Mexican and Indian. And the people in Abiquiu, being kind of on the outskirts of the New Mexican community on the trail, many of them had traveled on the trail, and they were guides and led pack mules and were very experienced travelers. And so these Americans and Europeans who left Santa Fe, when they got to Abiquiu, they probably realized they needed help. And so about 24 people, including some families from Abiquiu, joined on. So one family, for example, were the Vacas, and Vacaville up in Northern California is named for that family that came with the Workmans, Rowlands, and others. Unfortunately, they didn't get the attention that the Europeans and Americans got in this expedition because of the virtue of being Genesados. But they were very, very important in making sure that this expedition got through the trail, which, by the way, they also followed the established regular trade caravan. So they had somebody ahead of them. They could probably see the dust rising on the trail for a lot of this. And I'll mention one other thing too, just quickly, is that this was a pack mule route. It was not a wagon train route. So a lot of times people will see in the literature, wagons were used on the old Spanish trail. Not at all. It was just rough territory. So it was purely pack mules, and people walked quite a bit on that route. It was about 2 months between early September and early November for the expedition to make its way across. Workman remembered because Guy Fawkes Day is still a holiday in England, November the 5th. Most of us don't even know what that's about, but in any case, he definitely remembered it. Workman had a glass plaque made and had it installed on one of the doors of his house. You can see the holes here for the nails. The plaque was later removed when the family lost ownership of the homestead. In fact, they lost it a couple different times. And it was in private family hands. In 1941, when they had the centennial of the Workman and Rowland families arriving in this area, there was a ceremony on the front porch of the Workman house, which was then part of a convalescent home called El Encanto, still next door to us today. And you can see what happened. Somebody was handing the plaque from one person to the other, and it fell to the ground and broke into 3 pieces. So those of us in the museum world cringe when we see that happen. There must be another way to do this. In any case, this plaque is still in the possession of the family today. Josette Temple, who is a descendant of the Workmans and Temples, has this at her home today. And this is where we pretty much leave off. It's just getting the Workman and Temple families here to California, getting them established as extranjeros in a very different part of the world from which they came, and experience a lot of us have in our own families. And future editions of this series will take the story forward into the Gold Rush period, the Mexican-American War, and elsewhere in our local history. And as we do that at the end here, I just want to mention that one of the things that took place was that John Rowland, after the expedition landed here at the end of 1841, went to Monterrey, got a land grant from Governor Juan Bautista Alvarado for Rancho La Puente. The amount of land granted was 18,000 acres roughly between the San Gabriel River, which is actually in some parts of it the Rio Hondo today, and eastward to a border with the Rancho San Jose, which is Pomona. So right about here is Cal Poly Pomona. This is Valley Boulevard coming from the Mission San Gabriel through the El Monte area, crossing the river, through the La Puente region, Walnut, and up to Pomona. It's not quite to scale like we have it today, but that was the land grant. You can see the line here. This is actually properly surveyed by standards of the time. There was a guy who came with Workman and Rowland who was a surveyor by trade. So he was able to actually create something that was fairly exact compared to most of the standards of the time. The land grant was expanded 3 years later to almost 50,000 acres, but we'll save that story for a little bit later on. But this gets you to the arrival of the families and their settlement in the local area. Jonathan Temple did have a younger half-brother, Pliny, who arrived earlier in 1841 than the Workmans. He came by ship to California. He got here in the early part of July. And interestingly, he was born probably a little after Jonathan had left Massachusetts. They were 26 years apart in age. They had never met. So Pliny ventured to Los Angeles to meet his brother for the first time. It was supposed to be a visit, I think, of about 1 year. And Pliny stayed, did not go home to Massachusetts, and wound up marrying into the Workman family. So again, that's another part of the story that we'll carry through as we continue with the series. And part of that series will also be dealing with what I would refer to maybe as the twilight of Mexican California. The American movement west was continuing. There was always rumors of war with Mexico from very early on. In 1842, there was actually an American seizure of Monterrey on the mistaken assumption that war had broken out. Of course, communication was really limited back then. The mistake was realized. Embarrassingly, the flag of Mexico was put back up the pole, and the Americans left Monterrey, but it was just a matter of time before the American invasion of California was going to happen. And we'll also pick that up as part of the story later on.
Oh, we have a question that just came in. Considering the Mexican capital was so far off and being such a new country, did the Californios see themselves separate from Mexico?
Yes, absolutely. That was one reason for having that term Californio as opposed to Mexicano. And they did. And in fact, when there were times when the central government sent governors from Mexico proper to Alta California, invariably there would be a revolt, and the Californios would basically unseat that person and send them back to Mexico. That happened several times. They came to prefer to govern themselves because of necessity. And again, in Mexico City, there were so many competing groups that were battling for power. It seemed like there was a revolution every year or 18 months, that it just made it difficult for the central government to have enough focus to be able to take care of these other areas. Now, New Mexico didn't have the revolutions as frequently as here in California, but they did have them as well. And they were usually internal revolts.
Great. We're getting some nice comments just about how much people are enjoying the primary source material, the maps,
Great.
getting a closer look at these. And we've heard that from folks on Zoom before. So folks, if you have more questions, this is the time to ask. We'll give you a couple of minutes here to either pop in on Facebook or here in Zoom.
And I'll mention too, if anybody wants to contact me directly, I didn't put it up, I usually do, but my email address, I don't know, can we type that in the chat? Alex, would that be worth doing?
Yes, I can definitely do that.
If you want to do that, that'd be great. Then people can email me later if they have any questions, if they think about things.
And then Chris was asking to please clarify, you said that Rowland came to Monterey, but then talked about Rancho La Puente. To which Monterey are you referring?
Sorry about that. Yes, yeah. Rowland and Workman came to Los Angeles. They wanted to stay in Southern California. Rowland, as I mentioned, had purchased horses on the Rancho La Puente 7 years prior. So he had foreknowledge of the rancho. He went to Monterey in Northern California because that was the capital at that time. And that's where you had to go to transact official business, like getting a land grant. So that's what he did.
Great. Looking to see if there are any more questions. All right, folks, we'll give you one more minute here. I'm going to go ahead and in the chat put in Paul's email address. He on the screen just put up a list of some upcoming events that we have. You can see on August 9th, we've got our next installment of Female Justice. August 16th, the next of our, we really couldn't have titled this series any better. It's called And Then It Got Worse. This is our fiction book club, and they're going to be reading Ghost Talkers. So you can join us for that.
Alex, you said 16th. Is it the 16th or 19th?
Oh, I'm sorry, 19th. Thank you, Paul. August 19th. Then on August 23rd, we've got a program called Exploring Women's Rights in Los Angeles. Those will all be available and accessible on Zoom. Both Female Justice and Exploring Women's Rights will also be broadcast on Facebook Live if you prefer watching us there. You can sign up. Paul's hovering there with his pointer there. So you can sign up at homesteadmuseum.org/upcoming events. And please do follow us, stay connected with us at Homestead Museum on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you have joined us on Facebook Live today, we're going to be posting a link to an evaluation. If you joined us on Zoom, we're going to be emailing that to you. Please take a minute to fill that out for us to help us see where we can do better, to tell us what you really enjoyed, other topics even, and things that you want to tell us about. We love the feedback. So thank you so much for spending part of your Sunday with us. Oh, it looks like we have a couple more questions and comments that have come in. So let me take a look at those here. Oh, here we have an attendee who's asked, how much contact, if any, does the homestead have with current Temple and Workman families? I'm guessing that means family members. And I'll say that there are a couple of them that are watching on this Zoom right now. So you're all connected to them virtually at the moment. But Paul, you want to tell us some more about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. We're very fortunate that we have the kinds of connections that we do. So I mentioned Josette Temple, who owns that glass plaque. She also has the permit and the inventory of goods, lots of things. She's been very helpful in sharing those. She has cousins in Orange County, for example, who do the same thing, have donated and shared lots of things. There's a branch of the family in Los Angeles. So I mentioned David Workman, William's brother. He and his family did migrate out here in the middle 1850s. Their family is still very much in the area and still involved and active with what we have here. So yeah, there are plenty of people. And interestingly, we've had connections with people in areas that they came from. So I mentioned that John Sharp, who was in Clifton, that village in England, he's written books and articles, and he's talked about the amazing travel of these families from England to the United States. So we're very fortunate to be able to have those kinds of connections with people for a variety of reasons.
And speaking as if like perfectly on point right now, we had a comment from Amy Rowland saying, thank you for the wonderful presentation, from Josette Temple, Cheryl Rowland, and Amy Rowland. So some of them are watching together, which is fabulous.
And Amy, Cheryl, and Josette will continue with doing the Rowland part of the story too as we go along, because these families were longstanding friends from back into Mexico and through California, and of course, even related now, because Cheryl and Josette are actually cousins. So.
Yeah, super cool. Alana says, thank you so much for the interesting talk. Looking forward to the coming ones. And let's check Facebook here one more time. Lots of nice feedback, just great presentation, lots of thank yous. Looking forward to the next program. So I think that's going to be a wrap for us. We'll look forward to seeing you all back for future programs. Thanks so much for staying connected with us online at this time. You know that we love seeing you all in person, but it's really wonderful that we can stay connected this way. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day, folks.